So you can, I mean, I'll defer to you. You can absolutely start at the very beginning. The thing I'm most interested in is like from about my stage in life, but to the extent that there's context from before that's relevant, I'd love to hear that too. But just tell me a little bit about what you did and the choices you made and all that.
Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning only insofar as it explains how incredible where I am today is from where I was born, not only in terms of circumstances, which are dramatic enough, but also in terms of personality and in terms of my approach to life and what the things were that unleashed what I am today, which are, when I think about it, you know, and I articulate them outside of my own head, are in keeping with what's going on in the world today, especially as it pertains to women and the role that they play and so on, you know. So basically my background, you know, I come from a very, very blue collar background. One whole side of my family immigrated from Russia during the revolution, settled in Paris because they couldn't come to the United States. That was on my paternal side. On my maternal side, my grandparents escaped because he was going to be drafted into the Tsar's army during the First World War. And they were illegal immigrants in France. But my mother was born in France, so she was a French citizen. And we went through the Holocaust. My whole family was wiped out because we're Jewish. And the survivors were my paternal aunt, my paternal grandmother, and a cousin, and my mother and I, out of 18 people who were all murdered during the Holocaust. And all through this time, of course, you know, I had no childhood because we were in hiding, we had no food. I mean, it was just a disaster the whole time that the Nazis occupied France.
What year were you born?
1936. So I had, you know, it was just at the time when there was actually a movement afoot in Europe to go towards communism, or towards, which is one of the reactions, you know, that's why the Nazis were so successful. Basically, I had, you know, up until the time they invaded France and won in 6 weeks. One lesson there, the Maginot Line, you know, the French lined up their entire army along the side between the Germans and the French border near Strasbourg. And the Germans went around to Belgium and totally, you know, that's the blitzkrieg. So lesson learned, you know, you never fight this war with last war's weapons. So during that whole time, I didn't develop the way a normal child would develop. I developed in an environment that was very threatening and arbitrary. There was no, you know, it was both physically in the sense that there wasn't enough food, and spiritually and mentally in the fact that you could be taken away, like my cousins had been, who were my age, right, who just disappeared from one day to the next. So at the end of the war, one of the children of on my paternal side, one of my father's brothers, had managed to get to the United States before they closed down the quarters. And so he looked for whatever family was surviving, and he found his mother, sister, and nephew, and brought them over. And then my aunt, who was my mother's very dear friend, arranged for the rest of the family to sponsor us. At the time, you had to post a $5,000 bond in the 40s to make sure that people you brought into the country would not become wards of the state. So you had an escort for a year, but you had to get it together, like a down payment on a house, right? It was that kind of. So I came to New York in 1947. I was 11 years old. I didn't speak English at all. We lived, 5 of us, in a 1-bedroom apartment in the South Bronx, which was a ghetto at that time. And I went into 6th grade in a school where I was one of 3 white kids in the class. Everybody else was black. That was more black people in one room than I'd seen in my entire life. Because in France, you know, there were the occasional Algerian that wandered around downtown, but where I lived, there were no black people at all. There was. I knew about Indians because I'd read these children's stories about these Sioux Indians, but I didn't know anything about black people. So it was a culture shock of the first order, especially not speaking English. And my mother was able to move us out of there into Manhattan about a year later. She got a job, she found a place to live, and so on. But mind you, I mean, things like you have to realize when you see a person like me. So when we moved to Manhattan, we lived in a one-room studio, you know, with a kitchen that was a converted closet and a bathroom that had been carved out of a brownstone that was a much bigger thing and been carved out of it. And we had an ice box. We had an Italian person, a man, who brought a big chunk of ice every week to put on top of the ice box and who hit on my mother. She was a cute blonde French lady. So, you know, it seems like such an incredible thing. I'm talking to you on Zoom. And in my lifetime, I remember that distinctly. This was a part of my life for quite a while.
And so your father was killed in.
He was one of the 18 who died in the Holocaust. That's were my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, who actually brought me up because until the war happened, my father and my mother were both working people, and we lived in the same building, and they were my caregivers. The first word I said was a Jewish word, not a French word. So. You know, that whole part of my life was completely wiped out. I was a very diffident person. I mean, I was shy. I mean, I was not outgoing at all. I mean, I was, and I
How could you be?
I also had the disadvantage of not really knowing English, right? I mean, it took me a good 2 years to be comfortable in the language. So I was entering junior high school, but luckily in that part of Manhattan, it was a pretty good school. And I was a very good student in France. I was an outstanding student in French. I was going to be sent in a special program to train as a teacher. They had identified me that year, and when I was 11, to be put on a track to become a teacher, which is a big deal in France. So I've always been. I mean, I'm smart. You know, I don't have a problem with learning. But I really had no imagination, and I had no ambition. I was just an average, ordinary young person going through the motions. My mother remarried. We moved to Forest Hills. It was a little stressful because my stepfather had a daughter that my mother embraced. She was very needy, my stepsister, and so my mother gave her a lot of attention, which meant that I had to share my mother's attention. I was I was 14. So, which is already a very difficult age between mother and daughter, and I wanted out. So I met my late husband and when I was 14, and I got married when I was 18. And I left the house and I went with him he was drafted during the Korean War, and I went with him to Newfoundland where he was stationed. And then, you know, we came back to New York after we finished his stint, and he went back to school. He had interrupted his schooling. I was going to City College, and he went back to school, and I went to work. And then we had a humdrum kind of life that was kind of sort of middle class, aiming for middle class. And eventually, I mean, after a short while, he worked for IBM for a while, and he was required to wear a hat. And he hated wearing a hat, hated it all through the time he was in the Air Force. So he found a niche with two entrepreneurs who were starting a service bureau, which was because he had been trained on machine accounting. That's what they called it then in the Air Force. That was what he was trained on. So he had the operational capability of doing this. And he was taken on as a junior partner for $1 by two entrepreneurs who started a service bureau, which eventually was bought out by American Express. So when he was 37, Paul was able to retire, stop working, which was probably not a great thing for, this was.
So this is a very successful thing then.
Well, the sale was, yes, it was a startup, right? I mean, they started and then they got bought out. Like we've heard that story 1,000 times. And Julian, he's an example of somebody who does something entirely different. Well, Paul never found that entirely different thing. And in the meantime, I kept working. I worked all the time. I mean, I worked when, even after he got, he retired, but at that point I stopped and I had graduated from high school, never gone to college because I got married at 18. When I was 32, at that moment in time when we didn't need my salary anymore, I started going to Hunter College. And I went to, so I started in 68 and I went, I'm sorry, no, not 68. I started in 60, let's see, I was 32 and, the math, I was 32 and I was born in 36. So what year was it, 60?
68, yeah.
It was 68, okay. I started in 68 and that's not possible. No, that's not, because I got my PhD in 77.
So you just went straight through?
Straight through,
Yeah.
yes. I went to Hunter College and then I went to Columbia University. And I had started Hunter. I really loved New York and I wanted to give back. So I thought I would go into urban planning, which was a burgeoning subject at that time. Little by little, I kept getting more and more fundamental. So it went from urban planning to politics, and then from politics to political philosophy, the really fundamental questions. If we have a government, why do we even obey? How is it possible that small elites throughout history, have been able to control immense numbers of people? I mean, yeah. So the philosophical, the moral, all the aspects of how it is that men rule each other. And I say men because it's been men forever.
But when did you have kids?
So I had my daughter when I was 22 and my late son when I was 28. So at that time I was going to school. This was all about going to school. And after I finished, it coincided with when I defended my dissertation in 1977, it coincided with our decision to leave New York and move to California because our respective set of parents who were long retired, old people, especially in those years, you couldn't live in New York. Most of those people went and moved to Florida. That was kind of the path. But our respective sisters had moved to California to be where their husbands' jobs were. So the parents going to the son moved to California rather than Florida. And so all of our family, which was very small, were all on the West Coast. And Paul had no ties. I was finished with school. And it was getting more and more difficult to navigate the social scene in New York when Paul didn't have a job. He hadn't worked since he went public. So the conversations in New York circles that we moved in, it was not comfortable. It became, I mean, we had a very a nice group of personal friends, you know, that we're very friendly with. But the atmosphere, it was not, it was, and the pull of the family. So we moved to California, to San Francisco, and Gerald started going to a very prestigious prep school, San Francisco University High School. He skipped a year. And I got involved, not knowing anybody in the city. I got involved with the parents there. You know, I volunteered for things, and we met a bunch of people, and we made a very nice life for ourselves. And shortly after we moved, in 1980, I was actually hired by the headmaster. The school was brand new. It had been opened in 73, and you know, they had graduated their first class of, like, you know, a handful of people in 77. So when we got there, it was a brand new school, and he hired me. His name is Dennis Collins. He hired me as the first director of development. That's the fundraiser for the, because I had volunteered, on for big events. That was a big fundraiser for the school. So from 80 to 92, I worked in the school as the director of development, and that exposed me to some of the richest people in San Francisco. One member of the board was Ray Dolby of Dolby Systems. Another member of the board was I forgot the rest, but the Levi Strauss family, one of the women who, you know, was married into the Levi Strauss family. Another gentleman whose name I'm not going to mention because I have an ongoing relationship with him, who actually later had a big impact in my life. But anyway, it was a way of meeting people that I never would have met. So this is where it starts shifting. So all along, I'm this ordinary person, you know, that goes, that like billions of lives all over the world, right? Depending on the circumstances. But by being exposed to these levels of people and actually establishing relationships with them, I don't mean social relationships, but relationships that had meaning, you know, because they were on the board, and or they were parents, and I ran the volunteer parent work too. I was, you know, I had to persuade these people. I had to lead them to do the things that the development efforts of the school required, right? I had to give them the right tools. I had to train them. I had to give them the you know, the rah-rah, the whole, I mean, when you're working with volunteers and you're not paying them, you've got to give them, you know, something that they want, that gets them moving. So it was at that time, and I'm thinking back on it, I didn't know it at the time, that I started accumulating this capital, this comfort with, first of all, hobnobbing, you know, with people of that level, and the return, right, that I was getting, because I was making things happen with these people. I was able to make them do the things that needed to be done to get my job, to achieve what I was aiming for. So this was all subconscious. I had no idea that this was going on, but I was getting more and more comfortable with that. And little by little, it became clear to me that everybody puts their pants on one leg at a time. Right? There's no, you don't get credit for that. You know, that you have a lot of money, you don't get credit for that. I mean, not in relationships, not in, you know. So all of this went along, and in 1987, my husband died of pancreatic cancer at the age of 54, which is exactly what happened to Gerald 30 years later. Same age, same disease. And after he died, and this is what you know, it is amazing. They're not amazing, but is clear to me now. Remember, I got married at the age of 18. He was a stay-at-home person for many years when he would normally have been out of the house. I was the one who was working, but he was a stay-at-home person. We were joined at the hip. I mean, I had no separate life whatsoever. Not whatsoever. I'm not a sports fan of any sort. I mean, I don't care if this sports are meaningless to me. He was an avid football fan. And every Sunday, I would sit in the den while he was watching his football games, reading the New York Times. It never occurred to me to make a date with a woman or any, and do something else. Never. Because now that's not to say that I wasn't a strong partner in the marriage, and that he let me continue to work, right? I went back to work when I gave birth to my children. I was a secretary. So he let me in terms of, with air quotes, in an age when that was very unusual. I was the only working mother when I gave birth to my daughter, in 1958. Of all the young people who were in our circle at that time, no other woman worked. So we had a partnership, no question about it, but I was not a separate person.
Why? So why did you want to work? Like, why was that so important to you?
I have to fill my time.
Yeah.
And I can't fill my time with, I mean, I love to read. I read a lot, but you can't read 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
I love to travel. I have traveled a lot. I can't travel anymore. I'm not going to, because physically it's too demanding. But you can't fill your life with traveling, right? I mean, when you retire, you can't fill your life with traveling. Traveling is, I don't care how much money you have, even if you go on trips, every month, you still can't fill your life with traveling. You have to fill your life. I mean, your life is every second of every day that your eyes are open and you're awake. That's your life.
Yep.
And you've got to organize. There's a lot of things that you must do. There's a lot of things that you have to train yourself to do if you want to be healthy and contributing. But having time on my hands is an absolute no to me.
Yeah.
After my son died, I was going towards meditating. While he was sick, I was encouraged, and I tried very hard, and it did help me for the first year, I would say.
Yeah.
But little by little, I let it go, because that's not an answer for me.
Yeah.
That's not an answer for me.
So when Paul passed away, then you'd always been connected to him, but now all of a sudden there was a whole different thing.
So I was completely, it was like I was my own person, I was my own person. And that gave me a boost along the lines that I was saying before about, my becoming aware that I could make people do things, and that I could establish relationships with people that enabled that. I mean, I wasn't aware of it, right? It was not conscious. It was becoming part of my DNA.
So part like this conversation, part of the reason why I'm having this conversation is almost like being intentional about where I am and what am I trying to do is that's a lot of what this is about, is just thinking about that. So interesting.
And in that respect, so what this leads to, I mean, I don't want to, I want to be mindful that this conversation is your conversation.
No, this is great. This is great.
But after, so Paul died, and my children became very important to me. I mean, they were grown. Gerald, when Paul was diagnosed, who was at the time in Boston with Bain and Company as a consultant, he's starting as a consultant. He said, "I'm quitting if you don't send me to the San Francisco office, because I have to be with my family at this time." My daughter was already here in the Bay Area. And so he came to San Francisco, and, I relied on both of them. You can imagine it was a very traumatic experience. But afterwards, I kept working. And eventually, I met someone and I remarried in 92. And I retired from my job at University High School. We moved to Marin and we had a nice life. Uh, I was bored. I played bridge a lot. Um, but
I
it
didn't know
was a
you played
COVID.
bridge.
Yeah, I play bridge. Yeah. Well, I can't say that now, but I played bridge then. I used
Nice.
to go to duplicate. Yeah.
Nice.
But I wasn't by nearly enough. And the early part of the relationship, it was all, roses. But because we eventually divorced, it deteriorated. And so it was even less fulfilling what my life was like. And in 94, I had been a lifelong libertarian, really an independent voter. I mean, I voted independent because I wasn't, neither one of the parties really hit my philosophy, which was really a self-made woman's philosophy, of doing the things in life that move you forward. Only you can do that. That's just that's what my experience showed me. Just like when it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you are having your demons, I don't care how many people love you and how deeply they love you. You're the only one who can deal with that. You have to find in your depths the wherewithal to do it, because no one can help you out of your demons, whatever they may be, no matter what they are. So in 94, I registered as a Republican because I had an epiphany. I was represented, Marin County was represented by Lynn Woolsey, who had been elected the year of the woman, and who was an airhead, is a hair. She's absolutely, so I had one of those platonic moments, having been, knowing a lot about Plato and how he felt about being ruled by people who are dumber than you. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I mean, this woman. So I registered as a Republican so that I could work for who I can't remember his name, but whoever our opponent was for the 94 election. And it was a disaster. She wiped the floor with him, because this is a completely blue district. Well, it piqued my interest. I decided to run for Congress. I decided to run for Congress with my computer, which at the time, to remember, this is 96. We didn't have all these fancy things that we have now. It was just a plain computer and a little bit of personal money that I was willing to, get at. And I hit up a couple of my very rich friends from University High School time, and they gave me some startup money because I was running as a Republican. And one of the members of the board that I had become friendly with became my campaign finance chair. He raised a lot of money for me. I mean, at that time, I was able to raise $200,000 for my campaign. It was an eye-opener. So what I want to say about this is everything that had gone up until then was a buildup. I mean, I went from being a shy person, diffident, who didn't particularly feel comfortable speaking in public or wouldn't even think, or were not in situations where speaking in public was a thing. I sang a couple of times when I was a child, in shows, but I totally that was not who I was. So the whole episode after my husband's death and my coming into my own, so to speak, and becoming a separate person was leading me to the comfort of being able to do something like this. I mean, it's a really quite an unusual thing for a person to decide. Not so much now with social media, where people can, build the things like Andrew Yang did. But think in those days, we didn't have any social media. I mean, it was all retail. You had to do it one person at a time. And I loved the experience. It was equivalent in a practical, real world way to the incredible experience of becoming a PhD, of immersing myself in that intellectual, giants world of all the political philosophers since the beginning of time, including the Chinese ones, and understanding them and making the connections. And that was like exhilarating the entire time that I was in it. My life was full, In the same way, when I ran for Congress, my life was full on a completely different plane. But I was ready for it. I had accumulated willy-nilly, not specifically, but I had accumulated the abilities, the tools to be able to do that comfortably with a lot of it. So I lost the primary, so that was like a disaster. And I mean, for me, because I didn't know what I was going to, I was all revved up, what I was not going to go back to duplicate bridge. So I was very lucky to get one of the trustees that I had worked very closely with at University High School for a number of years. Was one of the 4 members of a family foundation, the Jacqueline Foundation, and I was hired after I was one of 7 candidates in a national search, and they picked me. So I became the executive director of the Jacqueline Foundation in '98. And then all of those things that I just described to you came into full force while I was in that job. The foundation was interested in first reforming and then transforming K-12 education. So in the reform part, and my life has been bifurcated, my career was bifurcated. In the reform part, we were all about getting rid of or changing the whole government schools. So we were anti-union and anti ways of doing things, the way public schools were run. The idea was to give children a voucher so that parents could choose where their children went to school. Charter schools were part of that movement, kind of like a second cousin, because it was really within the public school system that the charter schools happened. But there was a kind of a funny relationship between those 2 things. But and this is an example, a dramatic example of how these moments in your life, if you can recognize them, or if they make the right impression on you and you don't let go of them, change your entire trajectory. For me, in my career at that moment, just like my husband's death was in my practical, my real life, in my career, that moment was when I met Clayton Christensen in 2005. I made sure that we made grants to people where I wanted to have a seat at the table, like Jeb Bush's organization, like this organization, the Education Commission of the States, completely different organizations with different goals and everything. But we made comfortable grants, not you. We had a small, corpus, so we couldn't make very dramatic grants. But I was at the table in a conversation before they had gotten Clay, who at the time was thinking about applying disruptive innovation to social problems like education and healthcare. And so he was exploring with people, that were in the field, because he didn't know anything about education. And he agreed to come and be a keynote speaker at the Education Commission of the State's annual conference. And I was there, and we were invited to a private lunch with him before his speech, where there were 14 of us in the room. And he explained to us how he was going to, what a disrupting class was going to be. And so the proverbial light bulb went on. I mean, when he said education is an industry and is the only one that isn't using technology or is not looking at technology, except in a very, ridiculous way, it totally got me. So at the end of that lunch, I gave him my card and I said, I work for a foundation, and if you need some support, financial support, as you go along with this, please call on us. And we started, changing emails a couple of times. And then at some point, he sent me a précis of what he was going to write. So look at this moment in time, okay? Because I know how to put my nose in the door, my foot in the door, and I'm called upon to participate in this, and I know how to follow through. I don't let go. I persist. That's my middle name, Gisele Persistent. One of my trustees said, "You're like a dog with a bone," and it's true. I established this relationship with Clay, and he sent me the précis of his book, which was going to be he was going to write an introduction that was going to be about disruptive innovation, which he's the only one at that time who could really speak to it. He coined the term and he explained the theory. And then he was going to get all the usual suspects to write chapters. And I said, don't bother. And I kept the exchange of emails. I have it in my drawer in the file because he changed the book because of me.
Yep.
Okay, so the book became Disrupting Class and it changed everything.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying. There's nothing too small. There's nothing too remote. There's no conversation you could have with somebody that couldn't eventually lead you to have the conversation with the person. So your life has to be about being able to identify those times and making hay. I mean, that's what it has to be, and so you can pursue many different. I was lucky enough that it was very narrow, right? I mean, I was in a space that was very specific. K-12 education, transformation after the whole thing with the technology. And then it became my mission to change the mind of my colleagues because my money was too small. I couldn't do dramatic things. But a little bit, I mean, I'm known as the best ROI person in the entire history of philanthropic education funding. Because we made very small investments and they mushroomed in the hands of the Gates and the Rhodes of this world into hundreds of millions of dollars worth of working. And I'm sitting in my one-woman office, just using my nose and never letting go. So, so I just retired last year. I had a big problem. I knew I was going to retire eventually. I mean, we were running out of money, the small amount of money we had kept on moving down because there was no added thing. And I was actually having many conversations with Gerald and Michelle, my daughter, about what I was going to do when I grew up, when I stopped working. And there was not much on the horizon. I mean, it was really quite awful. I looked at, what volunteer opportunities there were, but the kind of opportunities that you have in a city like San Francisco are so retail. I mean, they're minuscule, a docent, and it's not even worth discussing. And unfortunately, Gerald was struck by pancreatic cancer, and then my new lease on life came about. I mean, I would give everything in the world to be a bored person right now.
Yep.
But it was not to be.
Yep.
And so, like everything else in my life, I'm making lemonade of lemons.
Yep. 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 Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that.